Hello everyone, and welcome to Earth Archives. Today we're going to talk about a history filled with heroic legends, power struggles, and epic wars, the 100 Years' War. This war wasn't just any ordinary conflict. For England and France, it was a life and death struggle that lasted for 116 years, starting in 1337 and ending in 1453. During this time, both sides experienced countless historical upheavals, and while hopes for peace would appear fleeting, the flames of war never truly went out. You might wonder, why is this war called the 100 Years' War? Well, its name is a bit misleading because it lasted not 100 years, but 116 years. Doesn't it feel like an endless rivalry between two nations? The root cause of this war is quite simple: disputes over the throne succession. Initially, the focus of the conflict was on the claim to the French throne by Edward III of England. At the time, King Charles IV of France died without a male heir, and the English royal family had a rightful claim to the French throne. However, the French were unwilling to let an Englishman become their king, so they chose Philip VI instead. This decision led to intense confrontations between the two nations. But the struggle was not just about a throne. It also involved economic interests, territorial disputes, and international politics. The war was marked by bloodshed and cruelty on both sides. In the following decades, the flames of this war spread across Europe, especially throughout the land of France. Imagine hundreds of thousands of soldiers crossing ever-changing battlefields, filled with countless rises and falls of heroes. It was like a blockbuster movie, and the most remarkable figure among them was France's national hero, Joan of Arc. The starting point of the story: the crisis of the French throne succession. It all began with the death of Charles IV. At the time, the French palace was filled with tension and unease. Queen Joan of Arc held on to immense hope, anticipating that she would bring forth an heir to the throne for the country. However, fate seemed to play a cruel joke on her. When she gave birth in the palace, what was expected to be a prince turned out to be a shocking revelation that stunned the entire French monarchy. The baby was not the heir to the throne, but a little princess. In that instant, the palace fell into a deathly silence, followed by an uncontrollable panic. Why did this news cause such a huge uproar? Because, according to the Salic law at the time, women had no right to inherit the throne. This law had been established centuries earlier to ensure that the succession of the throne would not be disrupted by a female ruler. Therefore, although Queen Joan of Arc's daughter was of royal blood, she could not become the King of France. This meant that Charles IV's dynasty lacked a legitimate heir. The entire French court was now filled with anxiety, with everyone wondering what to do next. Who would take control of this great nation? At this moment, the struggle between two major powers began. Edward III of England, as the grandson of Charles IV, believed he had the right to the French throne, claiming that he was a direct relative of the French king. On the other hand, Philip VI of France also had his eyes on the throne and was successfully elected as the new king by the French nobility. This marked the official start of the conflict between the two sides, with the rivalry between England and France gradually escalating into a bloody war. This battle for the throne was not merely a clash of laws and bloodlines. It was a collision of the fates of two nations and two peoples. Edward III of England, armed with a powerful military force and grand ambitions, declared himself the rightful ruler of France. Meanwhile, Philip VI of France, backed by local support, relied on the loyalty of the French nobility and people. Such opposition inevitably made this conflict a long and difficult struggle. In the days that followed, relations between England and France deteriorated further. The English army began to steadily invade France, while the French sought to retaliate in various ways. This unprecedented battle for power ultimately led to the outbreak of the famous 100 Years' War, paving the way for later heroes and significant battles. In this struggle, how the fates of France and England would intertwine became a turning point in the history of Europe. The clash of bloodlines and law, the roots of the Anglo-French conflict. Edward had a more direct claim to the throne than Philip VI. However, as you mentioned, the Salic Law became the biggest obstacle to Edward's succession to the French throne. According to the Salic Law, women were not allowed to inherit the throne, which meant that even though Edward was Charles IV's grandson, he could not directly inherit the French throne. As a result, Edward was relegated to a side-door claim to the French throne, stripped of his legitimate succession rights. Moreover, how could the French accept an Englishman as their king? This was not just a legal barrier, but also a deep-rooted national and historical conflict between the two countries. Faced with this reality, the French nobility naturally chose to support Philip VI over Edward, who was far away in England. For them, preserving France's independence and dignity was more important than anything else. France was a country with a long history, its own political system and cultural heritage. How could they allow a foreign monarch to rule? Therefore, the nobility's choice was ultimately based on their stance of defending national sovereignty, and Philip VI's ascension to the throne seemed entirely logical to them. However, Edward III was not willing to accept this. Not only did he believe he should inherit the French throne, but he also saw this right as an integral part of England's international standing and dignity. Thus, he decided to resist. His actions were not merely driven by a desire for the throne, but were a challenge to the political and power balance between England and France. Edward III formally declared himself the King of France and set out to reclaim England's territories in France, particularly the vast southwestern region of France, Guyenne, then under English control. But this dispute was not just about the rivalry between two nations. It was also a question of the power distribution across all of Europe. When Edward III proclaimed his claim to the throne, it not only sparked a confrontation between England and France, but also caused turmoil in the broader European power structure. The major European powers at the time, whether the Holy Roman Empire, Spain, or others, watched the war's developments closely and aligned themselves based on their own interests. If England succeeded in usurping the throne, it would inevitably reshape the political landscape of Europe and further expand its influence on the continent. The struggle for land. Early confrontations of the war. In the first few decades, the battlegrounds of the 100 Years' War between England and France were primarily concentrated in regions like Guyenne, Aquitaine, and Flanders. These areas were not only strategically important, but also fertile, making them the core of the struggle for control between the two powers. In particular, Guyenne, located in the southwest of France, was the primary territory of the English crown in France, and England had long sought to solidify its control over these regions. France, on the other hand, fought fiercely to reclaim the lost lands, leading to numerous intense battles in these areas. In the early stages, the English forces had the upper hand, particularly at sea. In the naval battle of 1340, the English fleet successfully defeated the French navy, establishing English naval supremacy. This victory not only gave England a dominant position at sea, but also put immense pressure on France's trade and military mobilization. With control over the seas, England was able to blockade French ports and provide essential support for military actions on the continent. The English naval advantage became a key cornerstone of their strategy for the rest of the war. However, Edward III was clearly not content with merely securing partial victories in Guyenne and Aquitaine. He decided to shift the focus of the war toward the heart of France, the capital, Paris. This decision was bold and dangerous at the time, but he chose to place his hopes for victory on military success. In 1346, Edward III led the English forces in a decisive attack and achieved a stunning victory at the Battle of Crecy, which sent shockwaves throughout Europe. The outcome of the Battle of Crecy was astonishing. Despite being vastly outnumbered, the English army managed to defeat an enemy several times its size. One of the key factors in this victory was the tactical use of troops, especially the deployment of archers. The longbowmen played a decisive role on the battlefield, proving to be the key factor in England's success. The French cavalry, unable to effectively utilize their shock tactics against the overwhelming firepower of the English archers, was rendered ineffective, and this shift in the battle led to a swift turn in favor of England. However, even with the stunning victory at Crecy, Philip VI and the French resistance did not come to an end. Despite repeatedly suffering defeats on the battlefield, the French forces, led by Philip VI, remained determined and continued their resistance. This war was not a singular battle, but rather a prolonged war of attrition. France, though consistently beaten tactically, still had the support of its people and the resources to continue rebuilding its military strength. The loyalty of the French nobility, peasants, and citizens to their country remained strong, and they actively participated in the war effort. This form of prolonged warfare, with its constant military strain, meant that although England had the upper hand early on, it could not quickly bring the war to a close. As time passed, the strategic focus of the conflict shifted, and England's control over its territories began to face increasing resistance. Notably, the rebuilding efforts in France and the emergence of Joan of Arc would mark turning points in the ongoing struggle between England and France. The shadow of the Black Death and the truce, the interruption of the war. The outbreak of the Black Death was undoubtedly a significant turning point in the course of the 100 Years' War. The plague, which began sweeping across Europe in 1347, claimed millions of lives, plunging the entire continent into unprecedented fear and despair. The war nearly came to a standstill, as both English and French armies were unable to continue fighting due to the massive death toll. Many soldiers, commanders, and even nobles fell victim to the plague. Civilian life descended into chaos, economy stagnated, and social structures were destabilized. Farmlands were abandoned, cities were deserted, and Europe's overall productivity sharply declined. Both England and France struggled to return to a state of normalcy, making it impossible to resume the war quickly. In this context, Philip VI's leadership came under tremendous strain. Although he had initially resisted England's aggression, the spread of the plague dealt a devastating blow to France's economy, and the political and social situation within the country became increasingly unstable. By 1350, Philip VI died from illness, marking a shift in the French royal family. His son, John II, John the Good, ascended the throne, becoming the new king of France. However, after John II ascended the throne, he was unable to immediately change the course of the war. The new generation of leadership did not bring an end to the conflict. Rather, it sparked more political turmoil and internal strife. The power struggles within the French and English nobility and royal families began to surface, further weakening both countries' ability to fight effectively. Although France underwent a change of monarchs, the division among the nobility and internal conflicts made it impossible for them to unite effectively against the English. On the English side, although Edward III continued to garner support for the war, England faced its own difficulties, including financial pressures, widespread public dissatisfaction, and internal turmoil within the royal family, all of which made the continued war increasingly difficult. As internal chaos engulfed both nations, the flames of war were reignited. The rivalry between England and France did not die down. Instead, the new political situation made it even more complicated. Especially in England, Edward III and his successors still insisted on their sovereignty over French territories and the French throne. England's plans for aggression continued, while France attempted to rebuild its internal strength and resolve to resist. More importantly, the strategic focus of the war began to shift to different fronts. After internal adjustments, the French resistance forces began to rebuild their army, while England did not easily relinquish its control over French territories. As the war escalated, new variables gradually emerged, particularly in the realm of territorial disputes and national reconstruction in France. The Black Prince and France's revenge. The Battle of Poitiers, 1356. As the 100 Years' War continued, the English army's tactics became more flexible and varied, particularly under the leadership of the Black Prince, Edward. He began conducting large-scale raids and guerrilla warfare across France, a tactic that caused immense trouble for the French. Edward's army not only attacked military strongholds, but also penetrated deep into rural areas and towns, plundering valuables, destroying production, and thoroughly devastating the local economy. This behavior undoubtedly deepened the hatred and resentment of the French people toward the war. In particular, local farmers and townspeople, living in constant fear of the war, suffered from hardship, economic stagnation, and growing disillusionment with the French king and the nobility's rule. One of the most significant battles during this period was the Battle of Poitiers in 1356. This battle was highly symbolic, as it once again demonstrated the superiority of the English army. Even when facing a numerically superior enemy, the English were able to secure victory by relying on their flexible tactics and clever use of the terrain. In the early stages of the Battle of Poitiers, the French army held the advantage in numbers, attempting to overwhelm the English with their larger force. However, the English did not engage the French in direct combat, but instead employed their well-known tactics, using the devastating firepower of their longbowmen and carefully chosen terrain to break the French offensive. One of the key factors in the Battle of Poitiers was the tactical deployment of the English forces under the command of the Black Prince, Edward. He wisely chose the location where the battle would take place, positioning the English army in a way that put the French at a disadvantage when they attempted to advance. Although the French had superior numbers, they failed to effectively leverage the strength of their cavalry. The combination of the longbowmen's firepower and the strategic use of terrain allowed the English to successfully counterattack and defeat the French. The most shocking outcome of the battle came at its conclusion. King John II of France, who had personally joined the fight, not only failed to turn the tide, but was captured by the English during the battle. The capture of King John II was a devastating blow for France, marking not only a military defeat, but also a major challenge to the prestige of the French monarchy. After his capture, John was forced to sign a peace agreement with England, granting the English significant advantages and further expanding their control over French territory in the following years. The victory at Poitiers allowed the English to sustain relatively light casualties while successfully shattering the morale of the French army. This victory opened up greater strategic options for England. It was not just a tactical success, but also provided Edward III and his successors with additional diplomatic leverage, strengthening England's position in the ongoing war. The rise of Charles, the warrior, and military reforms. After experiencing numerous defeats, France seemed to have reached the brink of collapse, especially in the face of England's overwhelming military pressure. However, history often brings light in its darkest moments, and everything changed under the leadership of Charles V. Charles V did not solely rely on courage and willpower to lead the army. He implemented a series of carefully designed military reforms that gradually reshaped France's military structure. The core goal of these reforms was to enhance the army's combat effectiveness and ensure that soldiers' discipline and equipment no longer put France at a disadvantage on the battlefield. Charles V recognized that only by strengthening the internal workings of the army could France gradually regain the upper hand in its confrontation with the English. The reforms he vigorously promoted included boosting the combat strength of the infantry, improving the mobility of the cavalry, and establishing military academies to train both generals and soldiers. These measures significantly improved the overall quality of the French army. With the strengthening of the army, France began to launch counterattacks against the English, and these counterattacks were no longer simple raids, but well-planned campaigns. The reforms introduced by Charles V not only significantly enhanced the combat effectiveness of the French army, but also achieved important breakthroughs on the diplomatic front. In particular, his diplomatic skills were especially impressive in weakening external support for the English. Through a series of alliances and negotiations, Charles V successfully severed England's ties with some key allies, depriving the English forces of the necessary support for their military operations in France. Joan of Arc and the Siege of Orléans, the arrival of God's messenger. In 1415, Henry V of England led his army to launch another attack on France and successfully captured Normandy, pushing France into an increasingly desperate situation. The English forces, like a relentless tide, continued to devour French land, and the future of France seemed utterly bleak. Just as the situation became dire and the morale of the French army plummeted, a young girl, Joan of Arc, appeared as if sent by the heavens, offering France a chance to change its fate. In 1429, under incredibly difficult circumstances, Joan successfully rallied the French army's morale. Her indomitable spirit and unwavering faith shone like a beacon, lighting up a land on the brink of being consumed by darkness. Under her leadership, the French army broke through the English siege of Orléans, successfully liberating this crucial city. This battle undoubtedly became one of the most symbolic victories in French history, elevating the morale of the French forces to unprecedented heights. Following this, Joan led the French army on a counteroffensive and, at Rheims Cathedral, successfully crowned Charles VII as the King of France. This event became a symbol of France's resistance against England, marking the beginning of France's rebirth. The coronation of Charles VII not only signified the restoration of the legitimacy of the French government, but also symbolized a nation, once oppressed, finally rising to defend its dignity and future after enduring countless sufferings. However, fate seemed to mock them, as the English did not give up their invasion of France. Soon after, Joan of Arc was tragically captured in battle and executed by the English for treason by being burned at the stake. Her brutal death was undoubtedly a great tragedy for the French people. However, it was this very tragedy that sparked even stronger anti-English sentiments. Joan became a national hero for France, and her sacrifice did not cause the French to surrender. Instead, it ignited a more fervent will to resist. The French people, with their resilience and courage, continued to fight, and in the years that followed, successfully drove the English out of France, laying the foundation for France's ultimate victory. Joan of Arc's spirit was deeply etched into the chapters of French history, becoming a symbol of freedom, courage, and hope. The end of the war, France's victory, and England's retreat. As time passed, England's financial situation deteriorated, gradually depleting the resources available to the English military. Additionally, the strain of prolonged warfare placed increasing pressure on the British government's finances, making it harder to sustain the war effort. Meanwhile, under the leadership of Charles VII, France quickly recovered from the grief caused by Joan of Arc's sacrifice and began to move forward cautiously, gradually reclaiming lost territories. Unlike his predecessors, Charles VII was not in a dire situation. He took advantage of France's internal rebuilding and strengthening, beginning to steadily recover territories that had been occupied by the English. A series of military victories since 1429 allowed France to gradually recapture key cities such as Orléans and Paris, pushing back the English defenses. The strength of the French army rapidly increased, and their morale soared, gradually forcing the English to retreat. As the French forces gradually recaptured cities controlled by the English, the situation for England became increasingly dire. By 1453, after decades of intense struggle, France had successfully regained all English-held territories in France, except for the small port town of Calais. Although England still held Calais, it could not alter the overall outcome of France's victory. After 116 years of the complex and tumultuous Hundred Years' War, it ended with a French victory. This war not only concluded the long-standing conflict between England and France, but also profoundly changed the political landscape of Europe. This century-long war had far-reaching effects on both France and England. For France, the end of the war symbolized the restoration of territorial integrity and the rebirth of the nation. Under the wise leadership of Charles VII, France successfully defended its borders and began the path toward national strength. After years of conflict, France gradually solidified its centralized system of government, and its political and economic structures stabilized and developed, laying the foundation for the later French Renaissance. For England, the defeat led to internal turmoil and struggles, ultimately resulting in the overthrow of the English monarchy and the outbreak of civil war. The far-reaching impact of the 100 Years' War. The 100 Years' War was not merely a conflict between England and France. It was an intense struggle over power, law, national identity, and the fate of nations. Spanning 116 years, this war involved complex factors ranging from royal succession disputes to territorial struggles, and each key figure and decisive battle became a classic chapter in history. Whether it was Queen Joan of Arc's efforts to protect the throne for France or Joan of Arc's leadership in both military and spiritual terms, the details of the 100 Years' War represent one of the most dramatic episodes in human history. Joan of Arc's heroic deeds are especially unforgettable. Her appearance was like a ray of light that illuminated France's future, bringing new hope to the demoralized French forces. Joan led the French army in successfully relieving the Siege of Orléans and witnessed the coronation of Charles VII. Her courage and sacrifice not only changed the course of the war, but also had a profound impact on France's national identity. On the other hand, under Henry V's leadership, England could not overcome France's resilience and unyielding spirit. In this power struggle, France ultimately triumphed, rebuilding its territory and dignity. This war, although ending in a French victory, not only changed the fates of England and France, but also had a profound impact on the political landscape and national consciousness of all of Europe. It contributed to the formation of modern European states and laid the foundation for later centralized political models. The stories from the 100 Years' War, whether the intense confrontations on the battlefield or the political schemes behind the scenes, are filled with deep lessons. Today, looking back at the 100 Years' War, we can not only feel its tragic grandeur and heroism, but also understand the shaping of national identity, the ruthlessness of the struggle for power, and the indomitable spirit of humanity. These historical lessons offer important insights for both our current society and future development. If you enjoyed today's program, be sure to give us a like and subscribe. Also, feel free to leave any questions or thoughts about the 100 Years' War in the comments below, and let's discuss it together. See you in the next episode.